the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of the 81 All Out podcast. This is your host, Siddhartha Vaidyanathan, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mahesh Sethuraman. Hi, Mahesh. How are you?
Hi, Siddhi. Always good to be back.
Great to have you here, and it gives us great pleasure today to announce the publication of our third book from our book publishing venture, 81 All Out Publishing. As many of you are aware, we at 81 All Out have been on a bit of a mission to revive classic works of cricket literature. We began with Mike Marquez's War Minus the Shooting, and then we went on to republish Mike Coward's Cricket Beyond the Bazaar. Today, we are thrilled to announce the third book in our lineup, one of Gideon Haigh's early works, The Summer Game, which is a sweeping history of cricket in Australia in the 1950s and 60s, and a book that is so many things at once. It is an economic history of the country, a social history of the country of that time, a book that is full of illuminating match reports, erudite essays interspersed in between, a book of great reportage, so many interviews, and most of all, as far as I'm concerned, a book full of love for the game, for the country of Australia, for the cricketers who lit up the game in those years. An era that's not as sexy, if I may use the word, as what came after, and not as epochal as what came before with Sir Donald Bradman's Invincibles. And of course, what came after was Ian Chappell and World Series cricket and everything else that changed the game forever, or so we are told at least. So this book was first published in 1997, and it's always been seen as this masterful revisiting of a largely forgotten era. But sadly, the book went out of print many years ago. It was again republished in 2006, but then it went out of print again. And it's been hard to locate for several fans of cricket and fans of cricket lovers. And in fact, recently, Abhishek Mukherjee, who is the content head in Wisden, told me that he saw it listed for 64,000 rupees somewhere online. And how much ever he loves cricket reading, I'm sure even that is a bit too much for even the lovers. So we're thrilled to bring it back now. And to celebrate this revival, we have the author himself with us for the third time on 81 All Out. Someone whom Ramachandra Guha, who was also on the podcast, recently called the best cricket writer of all time, bar none. So, hello, Gideon Haigh. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, it's nice to be back, and it will be nice to see the book again. It's so rare that not even I have a copy anymore. I looked at that when you approached me. I thought, very good rationale for getting this republished is I might be able to actually read it again.
Yeah, I approached Gideon when we'd requested Ian Chappell to write a foreword for the book, and Ian Chappell wanted a copy of the book. I asked Gideon if he had a copy, and he didn't. So we had to find a way to send him a copy.
Yeah, I mean, my mum's got a copy. My mum's actually very scrupulous about keeping copies of all my books, and occasionally I do have to tap her on the shoulder and ask for them back. The Cricket War was another one I didn't have a copy of. So that was another one that was reissued a few years ago. It was republished by Bloomsbury. And it is kind of a shock to realise that you've been around so long that you actually have an early period.
Well, yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, Gideon, to start off. You've written, correct me if I'm wrong, 45 books now?
I hesitate to say it, but I've actually, I did a count yesterday because I had to write a new book blurb, and I think the next one will be 48. So a couple of others happened when I wasn't even looking.
Yeah, and the Summer Game was probably in the early one of the early ones, right? Maybe like the early five, one of the early five.
About that, yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to, I don't know any other writer who has written so many books, but tell us a bit about what are your memories like of actually writing that book now? 97 must seem like 2 lifetimes ago from your vantage.
Yeah, it is. I'd written The Cricket War. That was my first cricket book, and I'd done a quickie called The Border Years after that. But one of the outcomes of researching that period of 1977 to 1979 was the realization that a lot of the discontents expressed in that period were the outcomes, the long-term pent-up outcomes of debates that had been interior to the game through the 1950s and 60s. And I remember my publisher, Michael Hayward, saying to me, the period that we know least about is the one immediately before we were born. And I thought there's a lot of truth in that. I was sort of familiar with the outlines of the story. I knew who'd won what. I knew the years in which games had been played. I knew the great kind of feats of cricket in that time, but I didn't really have an understanding of the characters. I didn't really completely understand the structures of the game, the nature of the bilateral relationships. I had no idea of the personalities of the administrative classes. I had a vague sort of overall sense of Australian history, but my knowledge of it wasn't particularly detailed. It was a period in which I think cricket was perhaps a bit more central to the predominant culture than it was later on. It was Australia at the time was a football country in winter, whatever the code was, and a cricket country in summer. So it was a period that it bulked large but mysterious, but it was still accessible. It was the people who had been its chief personalities were still alive and still compos mentis. And actually, as I found when I approached them, actually otherwise unoccupied, frequently retired, kids grown up, living at home, not particularly well known, not big personalities, but with time on their hands and a willingness to share their experiences. So I can remember very vividly having the idea of the book, thinking who I might start off by interviewing. I opened the Melbourne White Pages and I looked up C.C. McDonald, who I knew lived in Beaumaris, Colin McDonald, who played for Australia from 1953 to 1961, and I rang the number. It was as simple as that. And I said, can I come and talk to you about your career? And he said, sure. So the next day I was literally in his living room. He had some old scrapbooks. He had a lot of memories, and he was a good storyteller. He was a very interesting man, Colin. He was quite, he'd had an interesting and full life. Not only a cricketer, cricket had merely been a part of his life. He'd been an insurance broker. He'd been heavily involved in running tennis in Australia. He had a big context. He had a big life of which cricket was merely a part. But he enjoyed going back into it. And from there, simply a case of, who else would be good to talk to? I got some telephone numbers from him. I just started ringing people. I don't think anyone said no to me. Or with one qualification, which I'll get to. I sort of spent the next year just going around Australia talking to old cricketers, and nothing like talking to old cricketers. They're fascinating, endlessly fascinating, and it was an era that was both very familiar and very strange, quite remote from my experience, but at a certain level. Cricket is a very easy way to reach people. If you have cricket in common, you immediately have a great sort of repertoire of shared experiences. It's kind of easy to find a good wavelength on which to communicate with you. And they actually played cricket in a way that really rather appealed to me in my kind of sentimental, old-fashioned, purist nature. I found them good, sympathetic, intelligent interlocutors, disinclined to talk about themselves, but very interested in talking about others. That was another characteristic. These were not particularly egotistical men. They were good raconteurs, but they were naturally self-effacing. It was a function of the era, a function of the attitudes. And I think one of the early lessons that I learned was not to tax them directly about their experiences, but to talk, to lead them into conversations by talking about others. Cricketers love telling stories about each other. They love reminiscing. They love the particular camaraderie and kinship that is formed within cricket teams. So even though they were great names and they'd had the great honour of representing their country, they were almost as everyday as a club cricketer who you might encounter at the weekend. They told the same kind of stories. They had the same kind of perspectives. They put others first, and as long as they felt as though their careers were being understood in the context of other people's careers, they were very happy to share.
Interesting. While reading the book, what struck me was that it was not. There was a lot of controversy and there was a lot of fractiousness during that time.
Yeah.
But how, either because of the passage of time or because of the way cricketers were at the time, it seemed that both parties had reconciled to how things turned out over time. And this happens on so many occasions through the book. You find, whether it's the manner in which Ian Meckiff was dishonorably, his career was ended, or the way in which, or Norm O'Neill, or so many of these other cricketers who must have gone through a really hard time in their lives, but the way they talk about it, it's almost like they've made peace with it.
Yes, they made peace with it. Although I must confess that when I went to see Ian Meckiff, he was brought to tears by the recollection of the end of his career. It was clearly a very traumatic experience for him and for his family. He was very frank about it. He was very candid, but he clearly bore the scars. I think I was talking to Ian probably a little bit after Murali had been no-balled at the MCG on that ghastly occasion, and Ian had been there, and I know that Ian had to go home in the immediate aftermath of that. He found it quite triggering, to use a modern parlance.
I found that fascinating. One is that even at that time, not even the passage of time, even at that time, you record that in the book, that he made peace with the fact that he could have been a chucker. I mean, he in fact concedes to himself, perhaps I was.
Yes. Which
is kind of strange because, like Bradman himself says, nobody knows. It's just an interpretation. It's just an opinion. And now, especially after Murali, what we know about the degrees and the flexion and so on, it is entirely possible that nobody really knew. And for him to make peace with that, I felt like maybe he was not even chucking, but he was forced to make peace with it because people around him thought so, right?
Yeah, I mean, never let it be forgotten that these players very seldom saw themselves. That you could go through your entire career seeing virtually none of your own cricket. I remember talking to Brian Booth about his career, and I said to Ian, Brian, did you ever see yourself? He said, I once saw myself on a newsreel. I faced one ball and I was bowled. That was the only time he'd ever seen himself in the course of his entire career. So he had absolutely no idea what he looked like, but he did know what it felt like. And I know that he tells a fantastic story of facing Charlie Griffith in the West Indies in 1965, the experience of facing a very, very fast bowler, a life-threatening bowler, without a helmet in front of a baying crowd. He conveyed a very powerful sense of what that was like. It's an eyewitness account. It's a little bit like asking a soldier what it's like to be in the front line.
Yeah, I think the quote that he has there is, or maybe it's not him. One of them has it that Charlie Griffith used to bowl 2 deliveries at 80 miles, and then he would bowl 1 at 110, and you had no idea what he was bowling from his action.
Yeah. I love the fact that he calls that a line from the Bible into his mind at the time, because Brian was a very devout Christian. And in order to get himself through this ordeal, he summoned a line of scripture.
Yeah, one point about the interviews that I wanted to ask is that while reading the book, I mean, you quote all these players and you quote them, and there are chunks of quotes
Yeah.
throughout the book. And then by the end of it, you're like, how long did Gideon talk to these people? It's almost like you spent a week with each of them and they told you everything they had to say.
Yeah, look, I mean, I was learning a lot about how to interview people. I learned a lot in the course of the cricket war about how you reached a cricketer, the importance of knowing absolutely everything there was to know about them before you got there, or as much as humanly possible. So everything they told you could be fitted into a context. If they gestured towards a particular story, perhaps you could help them finish it. And of course, over the course of a book, you accumulate so much material, you accumulate so much first-hand testimony, you get the opportunity to test one man's testimony against another. You can turn up and say, well, so-and-so told me this about this. How did you see it? And sometimes they saw it completely differently. Sometimes, of course, in the process of coming to a story, they'd already compared impressions. So they were coming out with a kind of agreed version. What was especially interesting, of course, was finding the players who had never had the opportunity to do that, who had slipped entirely out the side door of the game and been completely forgotten, completely neglected, who had never told their story to anyone. Pat Crawford would be the quintessential example of that. Now, Pat played a couple of test matches for Australia in the 1950s and then kind of vanished from the game. I can't even remember how I found him, but he was living well outside Sydney. I think it was a place called Miranda, living in a very small, rather jerry-built home. And living with his de facto, and no one had seen him for 40 years when I visited him. But he was very forthcoming. He was very friendly. And he told me the painful story of the dissolution of his marriage. His wife was pregnant, going on the 1956 tour of England. They wanted to go together. They were young and naive, and they didn't realise that was not possible under the tour contract that Pat had signed. So when they got to Melbourne from Sydney, the Australian Cricket Board threw her off the boat and put her on another boat that was travelling in the first boat's wake. There was a period in the Mediterranean, Richie Benaud remembered, where the two boats caught sight of each other, husband on one, wife on the other. And then when they got to England, she was unable to stay in the team hotel. She was English, so she stayed with her parents in Manchester. And at the end of the tour, the baby had been born, and she said, "I'm not coming back to Australia with you." So he never saw the child again. And needless to say, this was an extremely harrowing experience. Pat's life had kind of gone off the rails. He disappeared from cricket. He'd never been reconciled with it. And when I got to the end of the interview, I remember this very vividly. I said, "Pat, do you have any mementos of your cricket? Anything by which you remember the game?" And he had this tiny little envelope. It wasn't even an average A4 size envelope. It was like tiny, and it had the word cricket handwritten on it. And it was a handful of paper clippings, no particular order to them, a couple from his period in the Lancashire League, one interview with People magazine, a couple of clippings from the Daily Telegraph. And he held them out and he said, "Here you go." And I said, "Pat, I can't take that. I can't take it. It's all you've got." So I left it behind. It wasn't terribly informative anyway. But I spent the entire day with him. And as time went on, I remember his de facto made some tomato sandwiches, and we had a cup of tea and a lamington, and it was just fascinating because this story had never been told, because I guess there'd never been anyone around to listen to it.
I guess you were the first journalist who spent anything more than 5 minutes with him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you also mentioned that he wanted to go and play in county cricket, but at that time the contract meant the board contract meant that if you play for Australia for the next 2 years, you can't play county, right? And that kind of scuppered as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are very strong strictures that prevented Australian cricketers from becoming full-time professionals. It was a feudal model of the cricket economy in which the Australian Cricket Board made extensive steps to ensure that it was the monopoly employer of Australian cricketers. It would never stand up now. It probably shouldn't have stood up then.
Yeah, indeed. So that actually brings me to this point, which I absolutely loved about the book, is that it approaches a particular story from so many angles, right? Like one, you're not just saying that this was a board, but you're also comparing that with the larger economy. I mean, Australia at that time was growing immensely. It had very little foreign debt. It was growing. The average wage was growing at a faster pace than the cricketers' wages were growing.
Yes. Yep.
So in many ways, when you set that in context, what rang the bell for me was everything that we've heard from Chapley about why World Series cricket came about. Yes. The preconditions were existing from the 50s. Post-Bradman, the preconditions were existing. It could have actually blossomed any time. But you had to wait for the TV to flourish for you to get the breakthrough. So all these linear stories that we've heard over years, you have this. I mean, you've always done that even as a journalist. But I didn't know that this was like the case even in some of your earlier work. So I was so thrilled to see the fact that the classic Gideon Haigh that we take for granted now of provoking, taking a non-linear story and provoking multiple angles to it, and not so much to confuse you, but just to offer the complex sort of picture in all its sort of dimensions. I mean, there are plenty of examples to quote. I'm just quoting this example to start with. How did you see that? The preconditions, let's say, for a Packer to take over was existing for more than 20 years.
Well, Mahesh, I'm pleased to have gone from my early period to my classic period. I think I've always understood that cricket is a fascinating aperture through which to view Australian society. When people talk about cricket, when people complain about cricket, when people champion cricket, they're often somehow talking about something else, some other feature of the national life. Because for so long, the Australian cricket team has been the chief sporting embodiment of the nation. It even, of course, predates the nation by, arising in 1877 before Australia as a nation exists. So it's often a proxy in larger battles, and we actually shouldn't be afraid of that. It's actually one of the great things about it, that weird, disproportionate sense of importance. I think cricket can take a lot of pride for having, for 150 years, been such an important vehicle for Australian expression, determination, and achievement. Look, I think you're probably flattering me a bit in the sense that I was only 30 at the time, and a complete bloody amateur, bumbling historian. Now, no university education. I don't have an undergraduate degree in history or anything like that. I'm just interested in history. I'm just interested in understanding why things are the way they are now. And one of the ways in which you do that is to interrogate how you got somewhere. So that's all I did. I steeped myself in the literature and the history of the 50s and 60s, the popular culture of that period. I tried to see what was happening contemporaneously with these cricket tours. I tried to understand the political settings of the country. There is actually a chapter about the politics or the overlap of politics between Australia and Australian cricketers, including the cricketers who became politicians, your Sam Loxtons and your Tom Vivers on the Conservative and the Labor side. Often these and the other thing is that in this period, Australian cricket becomes genuinely international for the first time. It had hitherto revolved on very much on an Anglo-Australian axis, but in that period between 1963 and 1967, we lose for the first time to South Africa. We lose for the first time to the West Indies in those countries. We've begun to tour India and Pakistan. We went there actually originally with political approval, as I discuss in the book through delving into the Menzies papers. Cricket was in some degree an extension of Australia's foreign policy. So it's a question of Australia. It's a period of Australia's awakening to the rest of the world. It's a period in which we actually begin for the first time to look outside the limits of empire. And these cricketers were pioneers in that respect. They were much, much better travelled than the average Australian of the same period. They were much, much more globally aware. It was very, very unusual for an Australian to go to India for any reason other than cricket. So often the experience of going there was very confronting for young, callow, often not particularly well-educated men. They got fascinating impressions of places that were rich and strange in all manners.
Yeah, and you did talk about this, I mean, in a sort of tangential way about how the cricket economics is also changing. The commerce of cricket was also changing because Australia finished a tour of South Africa, which was probably the greatest surplus that they've had on a tour, even more than the Ashes. And the amount of money that they were able to generate from guarantees, even from an Indian tour, was substantial, even though like the country itself was poor, but they were willing to pay for the cricket. And I mean, those were very early days, right? We talk about the '83 World Cup now, or the subsequent rise of India as the early days of this domination. But the commerce was sweeping, the cricketing commerce landscape was sweeping even then.
Yes, that's true. Although it's interesting that the Australian Board of Control, as it was in those days, was really just a clearinghouse for those funds. It had no freestanding existence on its own. It was not an organisation in its own right. It was a organiser, a collector and a distributor of those funds. It was not an organisation in and of itself. I mean, the secretary of the Australian Board of Control was one of the state secretaries on a rotation basis. There were no full-time employees of the Australian Board. It was simply something that one of the state secretaries did in addition to their responsibilities. So, people like Bill Jeans, Jack Ledwood, Alan Barnes were simultaneously officers of their own states, and usually the one paid employee of the state who did the Australian business in addition to that. It was still very much an honorary cricket administration run on a pretty genteel grace and favour basis that looked upon itself in a suitable light. They were amateurs, so they kind of expected the players to play in a sort of a semi-amateur fashion, even though they might aspire to professional standards.
One of the things that struck me about the book a lot, I read this book actually, I read the first edition of the book. And I read it in 2003. I think this was around the time when India were touring Australia for that famous series, Steve Waugh's final series. And I, following Australian cricket through the 90s and through the Steve Waugh period, if we may call it that, you get used to all these terms being thrown at you about mental disintegration, Australianism, the baggy green, the play hard but fair, and all these cliches. And I was reading this book in 2003 and thinking, there's such a different Australia and Australian cricket and Australian cricket culture that has gone around. And why are we putting all this into like a monoculture of Australian cricket? And talk a bit about that and how different cricket actually was back then.
Well, it is fascinating, isn't it, that the baggy green was not a cult object in this period. Players routinely played in sun hats, bareheaded. Neil Harvey, Keith Miller, Richie Benaud, they were never seen in Australian caps. They liked playing without that. They didn't think that kind of accoutrement was necessary to express their patriotic leanings. Ian Chappell, of course, famously doesn't have any of his Australian caps. He gave them all away. He calls it a $10 piece of felt. It didn't need that kind of totemic expression. There was a strong sense of an Australian kind of way of cricket. Fast bowling was important. Wrist spin bowling was important. Good fielding was important. A degree of athleticism was important. And of course, Australian cricket so often defined itself in contradistinction to English cricket. Now, we're everything that they're not. English players are very orthodox. They're very coached. We allow the scope for spontaneous talent, freedom of expression. We're tough, resilient, fight tooth and nail. The English are good front runners. They're a bit punchy, a bit effete. They're false distinctions, but they're things that over time have given us a certain kind of sense of superiority or a sense of self-confidence when we take the field. But of course, it was also the case that when you were touring England in the 1950s and 60s, you were making a pilgrimage to the seat of Australian culture, the centre of Australian culture. We were a very, very derivative culture at the time. There was a great deal of enthusiasm among Australian cricketers for going to see, the Tower of London or Big Ben or an English stately home or Jodrell Bank Observatory or, there was a willingness to attend seemingly long, interminable dinners with lots of speeches. There's that fascinating bit in the book where Bob Simpson, who's about to captain Australia on the 64 tour, writes to Robert Menzies, the Prime Minister, asking him for advice about how he should speak to English people, how he should carry out the ceremonial functions of office, because he regarded himself not only as Australian captain, but also a kind of an ambassador of the culture. And Menzies gives him a very interesting, considered, and quite patriotic reply. It's almost impossible to imagine an Australian cricketer, even 15 years later, thinking along the same lines. But this is the way it was, and it was fascinating to be given access to that culture.
Talking of Robert Menzies, I found it fascinating that this book could have had an alternative title, right? Robert Menzies and his cricket or whatever. Like he was there right throughout.
Yes.
Instead of Keith Miller or Richie Benaud, we could have had Menzies on the cover. He was pretty much the spirit of him was there throughout.
Yes.
And perhaps I have no idea of, let's say, the importance of cricket to the Australian society at that time. Someone like John Howard who, although he called it himself, famously as a cricket tragic. But,
yes.
The Menzies seems like to the power 10, So tell us a little bit about how much of it was a natural sort of organic love for cricket and how much of it was also somewhat using the cricket stage for his sort of politics and so on.
Yeah, and also tell us a bit about the cover itself, because that does have a Menzies connection.
Yes, it does. That particular photograph is one of Keith Miller playing a square cut, playing for New South Wales versus MCC, Sydney, 1950-51, taken by a photographer called Ross Freeman. And it was on Menzies' wall in his office in Canberra. That and a painting by Roberts of an Australian bush scene. And in some respects, I guess they kind of reflected two sides of Australian culture that appealed very strongly to a politician of Menzies' conservative leanings. For those who don't know, Menzies was Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister from 1949 to 1966, so he's Prime Minister through a lot of the period in which I'm discussing. He loved cricket. He lifetime's fascination and absorption in cricket culture and literature. He loved the way in which it expressed the bond between Australia and the UK. He was in the vernacular of the time, an independent Australian Briton who enjoyed the status not only of being an Australian but also the connection to a long extant British culture. And I had some years before I did the summer game, I'd been doing some research at the National Library, and I was having a look at some of Menzies' papers, and just by because I had an afternoon spare, I looked at the study guide for them, and there was a couple of boxes called cricket. I thought, well, got to have a look at that. So it was full of really, really fascinating letters. Lots of people wrote to Menzies about cricket. Menzies wrote to lots of people. A lot of people, whenever he went to England, he always did so around about the time of the Lord's Test match. He would often have a dinner over there where he invited prestigious cricketers of the period. He loved the society of cricketers because I think they were not innately deferential. Their sort of informality and companionability appealed to Menzies' social inclinations, and he was not above. The thing that really appealed to me when I looked at it for the first time was that he had written on one side of paper some notes for a speech about the death of a Governor-General, which he was to give in Parliament. And on the other side of the piece of paper, he had written out the averages for the 1962-3 first-class season. He was obviously in the process of choosing his Prime Minister's 11. I thought, this is a man that I could learn to like. So when I went back to do the summer game, I understood that he was a pretty important figure, both in terms of his cricket enthusiasm and his continuity. You know, his prime ministership was definitional of the age, and I found he had a considerable influence on the places that Australia toured. Menzies, although he's very, very strongly identified with the Anglo-Australian consensus, he had been fundamental to Australia's first tour of the West Indies in 1955, because I think it coincided with the 300th anniversary of British settlement in Jamaica, which he discussed with the Jamaican governor, Sir Hugh Foote, at a Commonwealth conference, and Foote had said it would be good if the Australian cricket team toured. It would conduce to the prestige of the white man. So Menzies said to the Australian board, have you ever considered a tour of the West Indies? I don't think the Australian Board of Control had to that point, but they said absolutely in a heartbeat. So they sent a team there in 1955, and it was a fantastic tour. In 1956, he was pretty fundamental to Australia playing in India and Pakistan on the way back from England, because I think at the time it was feared that the subcontinent was increasingly coming under the influence of the Soviet bloc, and that it would be good to plant a Commonwealth flag there. He was even important to Australia playing in the Netherlands in 1953, which they did as a detour from that tour of England, because England and the Netherlands, Australia and the Netherlands had been at odds over the status of Indonesia in the immediate post-war period, and it wouldn't be a bad idea for a little bit of cricket bat diplomacy. So, he was sensitive to the cultural and political significances of a cricket tour. He also played an important role, backstage role, in ensuring that Australia maintained its cricket links with South Africa, perhaps beyond the point where it really should have. So the 66-7 tour went ahead on the understanding that the apartheid regime in South Africa would turn a blind eye to the dark skin of Graham Thomas, for instance. Some unappealing concessions made there. But in those days, Australia did not have many vehicles in which to express itself abroad. It was known as a manufacturer or producer of commodities, wool and wheat. We were the country that famously had more sheep than people. What else did people know about Australia? Well, they knew the cricket team. If they were in those parts of the world where cricket was a significant cultural phenomenon, and this was a way in which Australia, a country otherwise very isolated geographically and defined by its relationship to Britain, was able to carve itself a kind of an independent image and niche.
In fact, till I read this book, I didn't know that the lucky country tag, which we use very often in our industry, because Australia has not seen a recession for 30 years before the COVID and so on, right? And it's been stuck to it for a long time. I didn't know that it was used ironically by the author.
Yes, Donald Horne, yeah. And it's still frequently misused. It's probably as frequently misinterpreted as Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA.
Yeah, I was till I read the book. So equally, I've got to plead guilty here.
It's a good book. It's a very good book, actually. And it still stands up as a critique of Australian kind of banality and apathy. I think it still resonates. It's a fascinating book, and he was a fascinating man.
Interesting. Sorry, just to harp on this point about the South African thing, even before the apartheid, or before South Africa was kicked out of the ICC at that time, or was it? What is it called? What cricket conference? Imperial Cricket Conference. Even before that, when Australian teams had toured, one of the remarkable things that I've noticed is that every time Australian teams toured South Africa or India, they had this sense of the fact that there's something wrong with the society, right? They're feeling sorry for people who are suppressed and repressed and so on.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it comes to me. So the question to you is, were those people completely oblivious to what was happening at home? For instance, Australia still had the Australia for Whites policy, right?
Yes.
You couldn't become an Australian citizen if you're not white, or the fact that their track record of treating the Aborigines at that time was not great. Was it because a lot of this was not happening in, let's say, in the places that these cricketers coming from? Like, for instance, if you went to Darwin, it's quite obvious. But if you go to Sydney, it's not that obvious. Is that the case, or is there more to it?
I guess, I mean, look, cricket, you're right, is a metropolitan game in Australia for all the mythology around heroes from the outback. It's a game that's centred on cities, and cities in Australia in the 1950s and 60s were pretty monochromatic, and of course, and news was local, and a sense of the nation was sometimes hard to get. Australia's a huge country characterised by vast distances, and is pretty parochial, frankly, and a little bit inclined to indifference where the rest of the world is concerned. But it was difficult for the cricketers to look the other way, to be oblivious to the way in which other countries operated. I know that the Australians who toured South Africa in 57-8 came away with a very strange sense of the way in which the black population was kept at arm's length by the rest of cricket. There's that fascinating interlude in 66-7 where Simo recalled Peter van der Merwe giving his speech at the end of the tour in Afrikaans.
In Afrikaans.
Yeah. And not really understanding what the significance of that, but knowing that it wasn't particularly hospitable, if you know what I mean. I know Tom Vevers.
And wasn't that the same tour where 3 or 4 Australians went to watch 2 coloured teams playing cricket?
That was in 58, but in 66-7, Tom Vevers comes back from that tour feeling very, very disquieted about racial prejudice in South Africa, and he, of course, does eventually go into the Labour side of politics, and he's a strong campaigner for the Australia discontinuing its sporting links with South Africa. I mean, the interesting thing about Australia's relations with South Africa is that it's not a case of South Africa being thrown out of the ICC. South Africa eliminates itself from the ICC by becoming independent, by becoming a republic in 1960, and therefore, by definition, leaving the imperial setup. It's only England and Australia who continue playing against them because Well, basically for the sake of continuity, basically for the sake of tradition. There's a strong argument, actually, that those Test matches that South Africa played in the 1960s were not official games at all. But I won't go down that path. But they were really bilaterally concluded. They were not incorporated in the. They were not organised under the auspices of the ICC.
And just to carry on this point, there's this remarkable passage that you write after talking about that famous 60-61 West Indies series in Australia. And of course, there's this great descriptions of the test matches and everything, and what a great series it was, the tight test, Gary Sobers, and all that happened. But then how that tour actually played a big part in the elimination of the policy, the discriminatory policy that Australia had because of the lobbying that happened after that, right?
Well, I mean the White Australia policy still had a few legs at that time. It's not like it changed overnight, but it was certainly the fact that that Caribbean cricketers were able to mingle so freely and achieve such popularity in Australia was hugely significant from the point of view of both Australia and the West Indies, because of course in C.L.R. James's Beyond the Boundary, he talks about the huge symbolism of Frank Worrell being the captain for the first time, a man of colour captaining a West Indies team on tour. It was played under the auspices of the West Indies Federation. They flew the West Indies Federation flag throughout the tour. That short-lived experiment in Caribbean unity. It does have huge significances beyond the boundary for both countries. The disappointing thing, perhaps, about that tour is that, of course, it takes another 8 years for the West Indies to come again. It seems almost inconceivable, doesn't it, that a tour could be that successful and that you would have to wait so long for the team to come back. But that was also how kind of rigid and backward-looking Australian cricket was at the time. That everything kind of had to follow the pattern of the seasons. Here was a huge opportunity, actually, that Australian cricket failed to take advantage of.
Yeah, and it was not even like the Ashes were like box office success at that time. They were not making money.
No, the Ashes were. The Ashes endured. Were still extremely lucrative, but they just weren't very interesting. That was the problem with them.
Okay, fair enough.
People turned up obediently to watch a succession of very, very tedious test matches.
One of the famous theories about that was Bradman asking Benaud and Worrell to kind of make it a series to remember, to play brighter cricket, as the tagline went then. Yeah. And coming into the brighter cricket, again, the classic sort of Gideon thing, that you take a linear story. You're saying, okay, the cricket was boring after Bradman. There was no life. People stopped turning up for cricket, and even like people on radio were not listening as much, and so on. That's because cricketers were not playing attractive cricket, as if all the blame were laid at their feet. And then you cover the other angles. The social changes happening in the society, how tennis was getting prominent, squash courts were getting established, motor sports was becoming popular. It was quite convenient to lay the blame on the cricketers. And then, I had taken this narrative too hard. I just thought this series changed everything, and before that, all cricketers were boring and so on. So it was quite relieving for me to read that. But also, more importantly, I was worried. I approached the chapter with a lot of anxiety because I didn't want you to break the myth about the 60-61 series. Like, please don't do it. Do not tell me tight test had some other context, and it was not just because the cricketers were thrilling. I am so glad you didn't puncture anything about that series.
It's a great series. It's a fantastic series, and the wonderful thing about that series is that it's one of those ones that leaves a legacy of terrific, really good film, really good footage, and really good recorded radio commentary, which really brings that series alive. I can remember when I was writing the account of the Tide Test, I was listening over and over again to the recording of the commentators going through that last over, and the sense of exhilaration and disbelief in their voices. It spans the generations. So you genuinely can feel like you were there. And then, of course, to speak to the players who were involved was captivating as well. They knew full well that they'd been part of history, and they were still kind of hugging themselves in disbelief 35 years later.
And in that series, I mean, the Tide Test, of course, is the jewel in the crown, if we may call it so. But almost every test was so engrossing. Like it went till the last ball. There were tests, like the very last test went till the last ball, and the series could have just been the reverse. The result could have been reversed if not for.
Yeah, and of course, 90,800 people turn up to the Melbourne Test match of 61, which is a record that stood until quite recently in the last 10 years. And you get a sense, particularly being in Melbourne, of a city that was absolutely captivated by these visitors, and the ticker tape parade that takes place afterwards, where quite spontaneously the West Indies cricketers are paraded through the heart of Melbourne. There's never been an equivalent before or since. I don't think any cricket touring team has ever been quite as popular. I mean, teams have been successful here, but they've never enjoyed such a spontaneous degree of public support and enthusiasm, to the degree to which I'm not sure that many Australians would have been mourned had they lost that series. It's a strange thing to say in Australia, where we set so much store by victory.
Talking that series, I just want him to narrate this anecdote about McGillivray missing the Tide Test because he thought it's going to finish. What a classic story. I just loved it.
It's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? I'm not sure a commentator now would get away with it. He was lucky that he did it with Keith Miller. He flew back to Sydney from Brisbane at lunch on the last day, assuming the Test match would be a draw. Now, I guess if you'd probably watched cricket over the previous 10 years, you'd become accustomed to a succession of kind of anticlimaxes. Your expectations of cricket were not that high. But I love the fact that they arrive at Sydney Airport and they hear that the Test match has been tied, and it's just not part of their vocabulary. What's a tie? They think, they must mean a draw. But gradually it dawns on them that they've missed perhaps still the greatest Test match of all time. Never leave a Test match early.
Unlike the Melbourne Test where 90,000 people attended, I think this had like 3,000 people or something. So you could have been one of the chosen few.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
I was more surprised that Keith Miller left, actually, given his instinct for the game and everything. I thought he would have stayed.
I think he took a pretty laissez-faire view of his media responsibilities, Keith. I do love that story that's told on the 70 tour of South Africa, where he absolutely lambasted the Australians for the way they'd played in a game against, I think it was Western Province or something like that. And is it Paul Sheehan and Keith Stackpole knew that he hadn't been there. He'd actually been at the races. And they confronted him about this. And Miller replies, you boys don't take any notice of that stuff, do you? What's there to say about that? Yeah, you're probably right.
Yeah. Talking about the Tide Test and that series, though, need to bring in another hero of the book who, I mean, again, there are so many heroes in the book, but yeah, I mean, Richie Benaud casts is such an integral part of that book. And there are so many aspects of Richie Benaud that, I've been someone who has seen Richie Benaud on commentary for so many years, right? Who had seen for so many years and had read about Benaud and everything. But then there is this one little anecdote that you mentioned, which I just had to read again and again. It's like that moment where Richie Benaud apparently was seen as someone who was over-appealing compared to his predecessors. And Richie Benaud is someone in my head who's so much, known for his restraint and economy and everything. And he was accused of over-appealing. So imagine what came before him.
Yes, exactly. I mean, he's but if you look at pictures of Richie, he's quite a virile specimen. He's got the shirt unbuttoned as far as taste would require. His appealing was notoriously unbridled. The wicket-taking celebrations of that Australian team in the 50s and 60s were quite heavily criticised. Interestingly, when I contacted Richie about doing this book, because of course he's such an important character in that period. Richie had declined to be interviewed for the Cricket War, and he declined to be interviewed for the Summer Game, but he wrote to me and he said, "I'm prepared to accept written questions on the subject." So I thought, okay, all right. I'll call you bluff, Richie. I'll send you 7 pages of questions. And he proceeded to send me back like 12 pages of answers, and all carefully typewritten, probably by Daphne. I then sent him a few more questions, and he continued to reply. He liked to control his interactions with people. I think control was very fundamental to Richie's personality. He liked to have things written down. He liked to have things on record. He liked to have a permanent record of them. In the end, although I spoke to Richie quite a lot over the years informally, I only ever interviewed him formally once in 2005 when he retired from free-to-air television in the UK, and then because he had a book out. And he was a very reticent interviewee. Thought very carefully before he replied to anything, and was quite guarded and always interlarded lots of qualifications in what he said, which is interesting because, of course, as you say, he was a figure on the field who was quite effusive, quite ebullient, quite charismatic. And there is a telling quote, I think, from Bob Simpson, where he says that he thought that Richie gave thought to everything he did from the moment that he got up till the moment that he went to bed. There was not a single unplanned moment of Richie Benaud's life. So he even planned his spontaneity. So I don't know whether that's a faithful impression, but it's certainly the impression that I got from reviewing his career and from interacting with him over the years.
I find it most fascinating that pretty much all the cricket world takes Richie to be this least controversial cricket figure. I mean, if you take Bradman, like Chapley doesn't like him. Even Chapley doesn't like him. If you take Chappell, there are other people who don't like him, right? Yeah. But with Benaud seems to have extreme reverence for Bradman. Chapley seems to have extreme reverence for Benaud, even though Benaud revered Bradman. Yes. And Shane Warne got along famously well with Richie. Yes. And Richie breaks all the myths, right? Like, and he was not even like such a congenial figure. I mean, he was quite provocative, right? He had a tiff with the manager where he goes to the press conference and he took his camera and filmed Charlie Griffith to establish that he was a chucker. Yeah. So he's been a rabble-rouser himself, but somehow he's come out clean, and he always had the perfect things to say at the perfect moment.
He did, didn't he? I mean, he was. His writing is quite methodical. He is an interesting prose writer, Richie. I mean, he's not often read. He's often interpreted simply as a broadcaster. But his book, Tale of Two Tests, about the Tide Test and about the Old Trafford Test of 1961, is a terrific book. Like, it's probably as good a book as it has ever been written by a captain from the inside of a test match. He gives you a fantastic impression of the various things on his mind as those two great test matches are unfolding, and the personalities whom he had to manage, and the resources that he had to deploy, and the tactical shifts, the fluctuations within the game. I think sometimes we're inclined to just, because his reputation as a broadcaster casts such a long shadow, we forget the contributions that he made to the game in other respects.
Yeah, I mean, there's that quote. In fact, Mahesh shared this with me when we were talking about the podcast, and where you mentioned how after the war, people who fought in the war tended to stick together, and people who didn't fight in the war were then. And Alan Davidson says that you never questioned it, and then Richie Benaud says, "It never worried me that those who had been in the war tended to stick together, nor did it surprise me in the slightest. They were lucky to be alive and had been, with all the others, responsible for the rest of us being free. And
Yes.
I'm thinking of this and like what Richie Benaud is saying such great things even like while giving
Well, I
like
mean,
an
while he was a
interview.
junior, right? While he was being, not treated well by the seniors in the team, he was a junior. He had every reason to complain.
Yes.
This quote could have come from Richie 40 years later, but this came then at that time.
Yes, he was precociously mature, wasn't he? I mean, but I guess it was a more deferential society. It was a society that was much, much closer to war, and the ex-serviceman cricketer persisted in Australian cricket for 20 years after the war. Because I think Wally Grout was the last of them. There was a pretty strong sense of connectedness to martial traditions and a spirit of self-sacrifice. Australia had fought 2 hugely costly world wars within 4 decades. That's not something that a country recovers from without a glance over its shoulder.
Yeah, the other hero of this book is also the early captain, right? Lindsay Hassett, for instance, that you talked quite extensively at the beginning.
Yep.
It seems like Australia was extremely fortunate to have these not just great cricketers, not just great tactical captains, but also like statesmanly sort of subjects.
Yeah.
And which brings me to another related question that, especially post-Chappell, we've always had this view that England picks its captain first and the rest of the 10 people later, whereas Australia picks its best 11 and picks the captain later. But that doesn't seem to have been the case all along. I mean, Ian Craig was a classic example and Johnson later and so on.
Yeah. We did flirt with that model. A corollary of the idea that an Australian cricketer is an ambassador for the country is that there is a kind of a character test for that captain to pass, and there was a lot of self-torturing in the mid-1950s about whether Keith Miller would make an appropriate captain for Australia. He was captain of New South Wales, hugely successful, widely admired. Richie Benaud thought that Miller was the best captain that he ever played under. He seemed to have uncanny intuition, seemed to have cricket in his bones. He had an ability to inspire confidence. He had an enormous capacity to lead by example. And yet, through that period, Australian cricket, whenever it had the opportunity, was reluctant to throw in its lot with him for all sorts of reasons, but perhaps reasons that are not unassociated with the same reasons that Shane Warne never captained Australia. You were never quite sure of what headline you might wake up to the next day, and if cricket in the 1990s and early 2000s was pretty shockable, then cricket in the 1950s was extraordinarily prim. So even if I think Miller was probably his personal life was perhaps a little bit less rackety than Shane Warne's, it was a game that was loath to run risks. I guess the other thing too is that the relationship between New South Wales and the other states was not particularly trusting at the time. An echo of present-day discontents in some ways. New South Wales has always been looked upon with some jealousy and some misgivings by the other states. But there was that period in the 1950s where the other states ensured that New South Wales did not have a selector. And there was a period where New South Wales actually, weirdly, discussed secession from the rest of Australia, with Victoria, because they were so irritated by the apparently parasitic relationship that Queensland and South Australia had with the rest of the game. I mean, it's hard to believe that such an idea was sustainable, but that was the degree of the animus.
It's funny. Talking about the heroes of the book, Neil Harvey, again, over the years has become this bit of a caricature, especially with his interviews, and has this certain image that has been formed of him of, talking about his time and his era and not recognizing that the modern cricketers were any of that. But in the book, Neil Harvey comes across as such a wonderful gentleman who was talking about, and such a great cricketer, perhaps the greatest cricketer of that whole period, perhaps I say. But yes, what was it like to talk to him and to relive his and to jog his memory?
Yeah, look, I mean, a huge test of a cricketer is how other cricketers talk about them. And no cricketer is quite so revered, with the possible exception of Miller, as Harvey. Harvey is the cricketer's cricketer as far as the players who played with him are concerned. He had everything. Brilliant stroke maker, wonderful fielder, brilliant tactical brain, totally selfless, always aggressive in everything he did. The characteristic gesture of Neil Harvey is 57-8 tour of South Africa. Ian Craig, his form is under pressure. He wants to leave himself out of the Australian team as captain, which would make Neil Harvey as vice captain his successor. The third selector on the tour is Peter Burge. In those days, the weird sort of sectarian tradition in Australian cricket was that you had to have one selector from each state. You couldn't have two selectors from the same state because the assumption was that the two selectors would gather up, would gang up on the other one. Peter Burge wasn't actually even in the Test team on that tour, but he was made the third selector because he was from Queensland. And Craig tells Harvey and Burge that he doesn't want to play. Harvey takes Burge for a walk and says, "No Australian captain has ever stood down from his team on tour. And as far as I'm concerned, this is not going to be the first time that happens." So they go back to reconvene the meeting, and Burge and Harvey outvote Craig back into his own side. A typical act of selflessness. Harvey at that stage had not captained Australia and looked like he might not ever get the opportunity. Then, of course, Harvey doesn't get the opportunity in 1958 when Craig is unable to captain Australia because of his hepatitis. Harvey is arguably the front runner, but because he's moved from Victoria to New South Wales, he's lost the captaincy of his state, and Benaud gets the inside running, and it's Benaud who has to ring Harvey and say, "Guess who the new captain of Australia is?" Harvey says, "It's you," and immediately says, "Richie, I'm right behind you, whatever you do." Doesn't think twice about it. Once again, thoroughly characteristic gesture of Harvey's. And as far as, in a sense, Harvey's attitude is consistent. You talk about him becoming a kind of a caricature, but it expressed a philosophy of the team always being bigger than individual players. He was always the one who was saying that certain players were getting too old and they had to move on for the sake of the team. It wasn't out of a sort of a petty animus. It was about a genuine belief that what counted for the team was more important than an individual's self-betterment. That's why Harvey eventually votes against Bill Lawry as captain in 1971. Not that he didn't admire Bill, not that he didn't think that he was a great cricketer, but he just felt that it was time for a change and that Ian Chappell would make the better captain, that Ian Chappell was the future of Australian cricket. And amazingly, Harvey managed to persuade his co-selector, Sam Loxton, over and above the objections of Donald Bradman, that should happen. And Australian cricket, frankly, was the better for it. Later, Harvey was pretty critical of Alan Border for playing on too long. There is actually a case that he was right, even if he didn't always express it all that diplomatically. Harvey was. Harvey belongs to that tradition of Australians who just call it as they see it. He wasn't doing it from a position of a media pulpit. He was rung up. He was asked his opinion, and he gave it. I kind of admire people like that. I've always admired that about Ian Chappell. About Ian Chappell, ask Ian his opinion on anything. He will give it. And if he doesn't want you to know, he won't tell you.
That's
The
true.
famous quote from the cricket war, isn't it? When he told you that I won't tell you. If you...
I won't fucking tell you. Yeah.
So talking of Harvey, one of the anecdotes in the book that I found absolutely endearing was him talking about his horrid test in, was it Oval or Old Trafford? I'm not sure. Against Jim Laker, where he got out
The
to
19 wickets, Old Trafford.
He got out to like a low score in both the innings. Second innings, he gets out to a rubbish ball, to a rubbish shot.
Yeah.
But when he's talking about the first innings dismissal, he says it was not too dissimilar to what one bowled to Gatting. And he said it as a matter of fact, right? That's him saying that this ball of the century happened in every era. That's one thing. And he said this as a matter of fact. He's not even trying to prove a point. Where did he say that to you in your interview?
Yeah, let's face it. It is the sort of the mirror image of the ball of the century, isn't it? The off spinner to the left-hander that pitches leg and hits the top of off. I mean, it's a great ball. You do watch it and you think that's a great ball. And then of course he hits a full toss straight to short mid wicket, isn't he? In the second innings and gets a pair. That's cricket. I think kind of Harvey did sort of relish that about cricket, that you were cock of the roost one day and feather duster the next. I really enjoyed spending time with Harvey. I went out to his house in St Ives, and he still had the bat with which he'd scored that century in his first test against England, the Sykes bat, with which he got the 112. I interviewed him a few years ago, Neil, when he turned 90. He's still exactly the same man, and it is pretty extraordinary that his memory is so sharp and so clear, and that he provides us with this direct link to cricket in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. He's an absolute national treasure, as far as I'm concerned, Harvey. The fact that he's never been invited to present a baggy green to a Australian cricketer just strikes me as bizarre. He's a living legend.
And in terms of the batting itself, I mean, from what I read from you and from what I generally gather, it seems that he was a really beautiful batsman to watch as well, and not just one of those, no disrespect to Alan Border, but I'm saying not like a Border kind of batsman, but more in the more stylish left-hander mode.
Well, he's very small, Harvey. He's actually quite a short man, and he was a quick man. He was one of those cricketers who was brought up to use their feet to spin. In those days, of course, spin was slower through the air, and it encouraged the batsman to come down the wicket. And Harvey was always one who was prepared to take that challenge. And he was also an outstanding fielder, probably the best all-round fielder of his period, both at cover and at slip, and just a natural all-round ball player. The other, I think, fascinating thing about him is that, he comes from this family of 6 brothers who grew up in sort of working class poverty in the back streets of Fitzroy, who continued sharing a bedroom with his brothers after he was a Test cricketer. But that was the nature of it. Cricket did not make Neil Harvey rich, but it made him rich in memory and rich in heritage.
In fact, he even went on a TV interview and said that he didn't have a job.
Yeah. But in those days, in the end, it was the game was always bigger than the players. It genuinely was. It was just economically, it was bigger than the players. It wasn't simply a case of ego. It was the game abided, and the players came and went. That's why, in the end, the book is called The Summer Game. It's not about any individuals. It's not about a constellation of stars. It's about the repetition of summers, the unfolding pageant of summer, which I think is still sort of bred in the Australian bone. Around about October, after the footy finals finish, everyone kind of shifts their attention to cricket. What is happening this cricket summer? Everyone, I think it's still the case that people still tune in to the ABC to listen to the cricket when it rolls around. Everyone's interested in what's happening on Boxing Day. Everyone's interested in what's happening in Sydney. The game is not the same, but there is a certain sort of race memory about cricket that probably was formed in this time that is fundamental to Australians' continuing perception of the game.
One question on this. You start the book about how this era started post-Bradman, after the high of the Bradman. It was almost like starting from scratch because you're not going to match those highs again.
Yes. Yeah.
And the early tours were not particularly commercially successful. I mean, they were not getting enough people at the gates and they were not making enough money. And it even looked like it was possible that some of the test tours were not affordable, right? Were not sustainable. And if you had 3 or 4 summers of no cricket,
yes,
who knows how cricket would have turned out from there on, It's a miracle that actually after the World War, cricket pretty much took off from where it left. I mean, of course, the Bradman bubble was burst, but the rest of them took off from where it left, which we should not take for granted.
Well, of course, cricket didn't run with a profit motive. The profit maximisation was not fundamental to administration. It ran a little bit like an outsized version of your everyday cricket club. And the way in which a cricket club operates is that it collects enough dues from its members to survive for the following season, with maybe a little bit in reserve, to continue to provide that kind of amenity. And in the end, Australian cricket administrators were drawn from the ranks of club cricket. It was a participatory democracy. You got voted onto your state executive as a delegate from your club, and a representative of your state association was sent onto the board. So there's actually a very strong relationship between the grassroots of the game and the apex of the game, but also as a result, a kind of a lack of imagination, a limit to a naturally occurring limit to the game's possibilities for expansion. There was no compulsion to innovate at all. You never thought of developing an alternative form of the game. You never thought of the possibility of providing cricketers with financial support outside of match fees. You didn't think in terms of providing facilities to bring about higher standards of professionalism. The players were invited to play for Australia. That's what it was called. You didn't sign a contract. You received a letter of invitation to represent your country. And it was not an invitation lightly refused because there was no other way to play cricket at the top level.
Well, yeah, I mean, it reminds me of that lovely, lovely little anecdote that Lindsay Klein tells you about where he wanted time off to play the game. He first said his grandmother had died. He didn't get time off. He said his mother was seriously ill. He didn't get time off. And then he said, I want to go play cricket. And they said, all right, go ahead. Beautiful. Beautiful. Gideon, how many books came out of the summer game? Mahesh and I counted two. We counted 2. Jack Iverson, of course, and Doc Evett, I think.
Yes.
That I didn't see coming at all. I'm like, I've seen this name somewhere. I've not read that book of yours, but I've seen this name somewhere. And then, I was thinking, oh my God, that's his recent. I mean, not recent. Now you're already 3 books since, but that was one of your recent books. That's when I made the connect. Did you have the seeds of these books germinating in your mind when you were writing that, or they just came about later?
Well, I mean, in some respects, the seeds of the summer game are in the cricket war. It was simply taking it back a generation in order to understand the antecedents of the World Series cricket breakaway. So you often find the seeds of one book in others. It's very rare that a book just springs virginally from the soil. You need to have kind of tilled it a few times. You need to have turned things over before maybe 2 or 3 things come together and combine, and you think, there's actually probably a book in that. and I could do it this way, or I could do it that. The other thing the other book that kind of got me thinking about the Summer Game was I read a book called The Summer of '49 by David Halberstam, which is about the first kind of great post-war World Series in the US, and it was a book that contextualized this World Series in the United States of the era, that immediate kind of post-war era, the dawn of a golden age of prosperity, and the concatenation of a great group of individual players happening almost magically and condensing to this one particular World Series. I didn't want to do exactly the same book. I didn't want to concentrate on a single series. I could see the decades between Bradman and Chappell naturally broke themselves off as a period. But something about Halberstam's kind of holistic approach, his ability to work from the micro to the macro and back again, certainly informed the way in which I went about the Summer Game.
Interesting. You mentioned the summer of '49 and not the '50s, which was also like a famous Halberstam book.
Yes, yeah, and which is a fantastic book, a fabulous book, and of course he did the book on the '64 World Series as well. So it was a period that Halberstam traversed regularly, and I think he's a wonderful journalist. He's that fascinating combination of journalist and historian, who can work at both. In huge kind of contextual sweeps, and also at the level of granular anecdote.
So I read this book pretty late. I think, I don't know if you remember. So you had some copies left, and one of the guys on Twitter posted a screenshot of him buying one of your new books that you're selling directly, and also this one. I'm like, come on, you haven't told me this. I've not been able to find this book for so long. Then I emailed you, you immediately sent it to me. And I have the ABC reprint copy. Right. I read your foreword for that. And you make perhaps it's a very obvious point for you, but it sounded very profound for me at that time, is that, you realize at the point of writing this book that history doesn't get written on its own. Somebody's got to do the writing.
Yeah.
And that's true of both your cricket war and this.
Yes.
So did you have a sense when you were writing it, or is that a sense that you arrived at much later when you were writing the foreword for the second edition, for instance?
No, I knew while I was doing it that I was, in some respects, I was glad that I'd got to these people while they were still cluey, while they were still communicative. They were very welcoming and very hospitable. They felt a bit forgotten, but they weren't especially resentful because, as I said, cricket had just been part of their lives. It hadn't by any means been their whole lives. There was not, in those days, the long afterglow of celebrity. There were not the media possibilities, that the reflected limelight that a media career can provide, that long slow fade. Once cricket was over for a lot of these guys, it was over, and they went about building careers and building families and having children and becoming grandfathers and by that stage they were looking back with fondness and reflectiveness about the experiences that they'd had. But I frequently left interviews thinking, I'll probably never see this person again. And I'm very grateful that I have managed to get their recollections down. I never hurried them. I never had to hurry them. These interviews were going to take as long as they took. Sometimes they took a whole day. I'd turn up at 9:30 in the morning. I wouldn't leave till 5 or 6 in the afternoon. Sometimes I went back on a second occasion to get more. It was, the interviews were more like conversations. I didn't go with lists of explicit questions. What I went with was pretty thorough and meticulous knowledge of their careers, what other people had said about them, what had been written about them, the sort of things that they might have thought about, the sort of things that they might have experienced. I was always very curious to learn about their families, their upbringings, how they met their partners, how they balanced the responsibilities of being a breadwinner with being an underpaid cricketer. Some of the stories were pretty tough. Players had done it really tough in order to play for Australia. In that period, it's a period of relatively high inflation. The value of the Australian currency is constantly being eroded. The match fees and tour fees for Australian cricketers are not keeping pace with the cost of living. It becomes harder and harder. It involves greater and greater sacrifices to play for Australia. Of course, they felt enormously grateful to have had that opportunity. But, there'd been lots of compromises, lots of sacrifices along the way, and it was very interesting to tease those out. Sometimes you actually ended up talking to the wives as well, and the wives had interesting perspectives. Now, the story of Mrs. Burge, I don't know whether you remember that. They're driving across the Story Street Bridge after a day's play during a test match, and she says... she's heavily pregnant, and she says, turn left here for the hospital because my waters have just broken. That's a fantastic story. There you go. That's what happens.
I love that final chapter where you cover for instance, when I started reading the book, you're talking about tours which are taking 170 days and 180 days. Yeah. And the natural question for a modern from the modern prism is, oh my God, what about the family? What about the rest of their lives? And what happened if somebody fell sick? And naturally, I was thinking about Virat Kohli leaving Australia for childbirth, Rohit Sharma leaving Australia for childbirth. Mm-hmm. They were not leaving, of course, but what was happening? And they couldn't have seen them for 6 months. And then you answer my question in one of the later chapters where you kind of dig deep into this.
A lot of cricketers had children on tour. And depended on their wife to look after those arrangements. I think my favourite story was the one that John Rutherford told me about. He was engaged when he went on the 56 tour of England, and he got a letter halfway through the tour from his fiancée saying she didn't think that she could carry on the engagement because she was just too lonely. She was too lost. So he had to book himself a trunk call to Australia, and it took him weeks to arrange it. And they had to tee up a time that they would both be available on the phone. And it happened to coincide with him being on the field in a game. And he heard the commentator on the radio talking about, oh, there's Rutherford, coming off the field for a call of nature. And being unaware, of course, that he'd had to call his fiancée in order to salvage their relationship. The happy side of that story was that he married her and they had children and lived happily ever after. But those kind of contingencies did arise, and players had to make allowances for them.
And then there is this bit where about the 69 tour of India where, or maybe it was one of the earlier tours of India, where one of the players falls seriously sick, but then requests the press person to not write it because then the family would get really worried.
The family, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that 59-60 tour of India and Pakistan, where I think 4 players go home sick, despite the fact that they brought a doctor on the tour, that's an extraordinary event. Actually, the doctor on the tour was Colin McDonald's brother Ian, who was an infectious diseases doctor in Melbourne, and he did a course in tropical medicine in order to accompany the Australian team. It just so happened that, of course, he'd kept wicket for Victoria, so he was a useful man to have around as a potential reserve cricketer. But he lent me his diary of that trip. And it's absolutely fascinating. Not many diaries were kept in that era, but he had one. And of course, it's written from a medical perspective. The challenges, the day-to-day challenges of getting a team through a tour of the subcontinent in conditions of extremely variable hygiene, a very, very long way from home. Lovely man, Ian, and had a fascinating story to tell.
Yeah, so just want to wrap up with the final bit where, of course, you write a lot about Bob Simpson and Bill Lawry through the late 60s. But for me, like towards the end of the book, especially when you have the postscript and you mention how the day Lawry was dropped.
Yes.
And it's the equanimity with which he accepts that at that point of time. It just speaks so much to that time. Or is it? It's, for me, it's like it was such an apt summary of the book. And then you have that Sheehan quote right at the end where he sort of contrasts Lawry with Chappell and talks about how Australia had gone from being this place where an autocratic leader was then giving way to someone so much more anti-establishment. And that was such a beautiful way to sum it. But I'm just thinking of, again, the Bill Lawry in my imagination is, of course, totally different and has been, commentary has played a big role in it. It's all happening at the WACA. But the Bill Lawry who was told he was dropped, he just, no emotion. He just said, I thought so.
Yeah. You could probably see it coming, Bill. He's pretty sane, pretty sober, intelligent man. I mean, in some respects, the stranger selection is Australia not taking Lawry on the tour of England in 1972 when they really didn't have anyone to open the batting. They used a mixture of Bruce Francis and Graham Watson and Ross Edwards to get through that tour. Australian cricket was pretty unsentimental in those days. Once you fulfilled your usefulness, you were moved on pretty quickly. It's a different time. It's a different set of attitudes. I think that that period does radicalise Chappell. I mean, if he hadn't been inclined that way anyway, the circumstances of the 69-70 tour of India and South Africa, followed by the hasty justice meted out to Bill, would have done so. So, sort of from that point on, you sense that Chappelli, there's going to be some sort of reckoning between him and the establishment. It takes a while, because it takes a long while for a Kerry Packer to appear and for John Cornell and Austin Robertson to emerge as intermediaries between the media baron and the disgruntled players. You've got that kind of perfect storm of circumstances in 1977 that makes World Series cricket possible. But in order to understand where you're going, it's often pretty important to understand where you've been, and I certainly think that Summer Game even now has sort of lessons to teach us about the way in which generational change, if it's not managed, can become very difficult for the game to contain. Certain forces are irresistible, even when they meet immovable objects.
Would you say, looking back at it and given everything that you've written, would you say that was probably one of your more sentimental works? And I mean that in a good way.
I'm a pretty sentimental kind of guy. There's a degree of sentimentality, or maybe disillusioned idealism in everything I write. I'm not a cynic. It's every other bugger who's a cynic. I'm like Diogenes, walking around with a lantern looking for an honest man. It was certainly one of the loveliest books I've ever done. There was a great range of experiences, fascinating group of personalities to survey, an enormous privilege to spend so much time with these people. And it's a book that I've gone back to because it is a time capsule. It is a period that's now almost all the people that I interviewed in that book are gone. So in some respects, I can feel as though I did cricket a good turn by getting them. It's a gift. As corny as it sounds, it is actually a gift to cricket, a gift to posterity. And you talk a bit about the way in which I quote a lot of these players. I made a point of ensuring that their voices were heard, because in some respects I felt as though I was helping them write the book that they wouldn't otherwise write. I wanted to create their own testimonial. I guide their testimonial at the same time by introducing sort of aspects of the macro environment, but to help them tell their own tale in much the same way as I did in the cricket war. They're all out there, and it was a matter of me doing them honour.
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you again, Gideon, and for all our listeners, this is a treat waiting for you. I will put the links to where you can buy this book. I hope that all of you pick it up, read it, take your time. It's a really rewarding book because it's quite long, but it really nourishes by the end of it. And it's not really I would think of it as much more than a cricket book. It is a book about Australia in the 50s and 60s, as far as I'm concerned, with cricket as a kind of a lens through which he's telling the stories. But then marvelous. I mean, Jack, we didn't even talk about Jack Iverson, the subject of course, such a good book of yours. But even that little bit that you write about him in the book, it's so touching. It's so... It just leaves you with feeling, oh, what a cricketer he must have been. And then, of course, you did us a treat by writing a whole book about him. So, yeah.
There's so many fascinating characters. I mean, even the chat we started with was about an obscure cricketer. And there was another leg spinner or a spinner who flourished pretty late in his life, right? I forgot his name now.
Peter Philpott.
Oh, Peter Philpott, yeah. Who died only recently. And I thought I could cast my mind back to the day that I watched a game of school cricket with him, talking about his career. He was coaching at that time, and we just sat on the boundary edge and chatted for 3 or 4 hours while this game was on. He was shouting encouragement to the kids on the field. When they came off, he went and talked to them, and then he'd come back. And just a lovely day of talking cricket with a terrific bloke. Lots of days like that in the course of the summer game, and it's been a pleasure to relive them with you. I should thank you two guys for taking an interest in the book. I certainly appreciate it because I'm going to get a copy again. That'll be nice.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and. Talking about cricketers, there are so many cricketers who you can understand so much better in this book. I mean, for me personally, it was Graham Mackenzie. I mean, you hear about Ray Lindwall, you hear about Dennis Lillee and Thompson, but then there's this huge gap in between that Mackenzie filled. And you see his record, and you're like, such a fantastic cricketer, and so little written about him. And then, of course, you have Gideon writing
it's awesome.
Really well about him.
Awesome cricketer, and a lovely, lovely man as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. So yes,
they were lovely men. They really are. They really were and are, and it's a great period. It's a great period which, of course, I never saw, but somehow the cricketers that you never saw lead such richer lives for the way in which they're created in your imagination.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for bringing them to life, and it's our pleasure and honor to bring back this book to life. As I said, I read this in 2003, and I thought, what a fantastic book. And then I realized it went out of print, and I'm like, okay. And now I actually have the power to do something about it. So it comes. Please pick it up. Keep it on your shelves. The physical copy is great. Though Mahesh will snigger a bit, but
I'm from Singapore.
The physical book, and I mean, you can pick up the other 2 books that we have republished as well. But yeah, this is about this particular episode, Summer Game. Thank you, Gideon, and we hope to have you again at some point of time to talk about other books and other things, and politics and cricket and riding the chariot in Ahmedabad, etc. But thank you for joining.
Does it politics in cricket?
Absolutely. Thank you. 81allout.com is our website. At 81allout is our Twitter handle. Please rate and review the podcast if you can, if you like it. It really helps for more people to find us. And we'll join you soon for another episode in a week or 10 days' time. Thank you.
India have won the series. They're going to get back for 2. India home. Lords goes wide.